Okay, so the speakers, I'm just going to introduce the first four for phase one. And we will lead off with Peter Derrick, who is a transit historian who works for the Bronx Historical Society from 1977 to 1996. He worked for the New York State Legislature and the Metropolitan Transportation Authority on issues relating to the capital needs and financing of the region's transit network. He is the author of Tunneling to the Future, the story of the great subway expansion that saved New York. Came out in 2001 from NYU Press, and he earned his doctorate at NYU. Next, Robert Snyder, a historian, is an associate professor and director of the Journalism and Media Studies program in the Visual and Performing Arts Department at Rutgers Newark. He is also an affiliate member of the Rutgers Newark History Department. He is the author of Transit Talk, New York's Bus and Subway Workers Tell Their Stories, from Rutgers Press and the New York Transit Museum, 1997, and several other books. He directed the research for Rick Burns' Film New York and is the former editor of Media Studies Journal, has worked at several newspapers, and has written articles and reviews for both scholarly and popular publications. He got his doctorate in American history at NYU. Third will be Jeff Zupan, who serves as the Senior Fellow for Transportation for the Regional Plan Association. He has led RPA's work in all facets of transportation planning and policy since 1990 and was RPA's chief planner from 1969 to 1980. From 1980 to 1990, he was Director of Planning for New Jersey Transit, where he directed the agency's New Initiatives program, which led directly to over $2 billion of transit investments. He is the co-author of three major books: Urban Rail in America, Public Transportation and Land Use Policy, and Urban Space for Pedestrians. A registered professional engineer in New York State, Mr. Zupan is a graduate of City College of New York and Polytechnic Institute of Brooklyn. And then fourth, Richard Ravitch is a principal at Ravitch, Rice and Company. He was chairman of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority from 1979 to 1983. As chairman, he initiated the first MTA five-year capital program for 1982 to 1986, which began the ongoing effort to restore the region's subway, bus, and commuter rail systems to a state of good repair. Most importantly, this first program was fully funded, in part through a number of innovative financing techniques. He also began the move to a fare card system at the MTA. He is a graduate of the Yale University Law School. Okay, over to Peter Derrick. Thanks.
Hi. When we were organizing this forum last February and March, we intended it to be primarily a celebration of the New York City subway and its importance to New York City. Since that time, as probably all of you in the audience know, there have been a number of events that have had to do with financing the MTA, another bout of should we increase the fare, and a big battle that's about to loom about capital funding, so much so that the Tri-State Transportation Campaign's most recent bulletin has a headline, "Budget Crisis Overshadows Transit Centennial." That is to say, last week when they had the 100th anniversary and there was a subway ride from City Hall up, all the reporters could do was ask questions about the current problems rather than about the history of the subway. Well, I thought about that, and I think a lot of other people on this panel have thought about that, and in a way, it's sort of good that happened, because one of the things that has happened in the past, since the 1890s actually, is that there have been financial crises having to do with how to expand the subway system and then how to maintain the subway system, and there's been a perpetual battle over what the fare should be. So the financing issues have come and gone every 10, 15, 20 years or so, and the good thing to say about New York is that every time that's happened, reasonable people have come together to take care of the situation. They haven't produced a permanent fix, that's why we're where we are now, but that's really the thing, since I only have 15 minutes, is what I decided to talk about. I'm going to try to do a very brief overview of how the subway system is developed and highlight that one persistent problem. That is to say, a lack of agreement over who should pay for both the construction of the subway as well as for who should pay for the operations of the subway. The key fact to remember is that because the private companies that were involved in the subway system, first the IRT, or Interborough Rapid Transit, and later the Brooklyn Rapid Transit Company, which later became the BMT, they were reluctant to put up money, as well as any other private capitalist, to build the subway system. So from the very beginning, the city of New York has been involved in financing the construction of the subway system. And that has meant that from the very beginning, that is to say the 1890s, the subway has been a political issue. In fact, from the election of 1901 until the election of 1925, or actually probably 1929, the subway was the key issue in New York City politics, the biggest issue, which is one of the reasons that the Transit Authority was eventually created in the MTA to get it out of city politics. In the late, well, I know it hasn't gotten out of city politics, but in the late 19th century, again, most of you are probably transit fans, there were two networks of solely elevated lines that were built with private capital in both Manhattan and the Bronx. The one system, the Manhattan Elevated Railway Company, which was later incorporated into the IRT. In Brooklyn, there was another elevated railroad system operated by the Brooklyn Rapid Transit Company. But they were solely elevated lines, and only pieces of those systems still exist. The first subway became a debate in the early 1890s when it was clear that electric traction, that is to say powering trains by electricity, was feasible. And so all of the people in New York started clamoring for an electric subway system, and London had just built an electric underground tube, their first tube actually, that showed that it could work. And there was a big battle about it. They did first go to private companies and ask them whether they wanted to fund it, but they also said that the fare would have to be 5 cents. That was fixed in a in a state law in 1894. And at a 5-cent fare, the bankers told the city that they were not going to take the risk to build a subway because it was much more expensive to build than elevateds. In fact, one of the proposals was to build a number of elevated lines instead of subway lines. So the end result was that the people of the city of New York were asked to vote on whether the city should put up the money to build the subway, and they did that. And then a number of years later, in 1900, a contract was signed with a company that became the IRT to build the subway and to operate it on a 50-year lease at a 5-cent fare. And that's the subway we celebrated the opening of, the first piece of, on October 27th, 100 years ago in 1904. That first IRT subway system opened between 1904 and 1908, the different pieces of it, and it was a relatively short system. It was only 26 miles long. I'm not going to go through the route details, you probably all know it. It was sort of the IRT on the east side and the IRT on the west side, with a branch to the Bronx and one up to Van Cortlandt Park and another line to Brooklyn. Anyway, once that subway was approved, every part of New York City wanted new subway lines. We're in a pre-highway era, so people see that open land in the Bronx and Brooklyn and Queens can be developed only by extending rapid transit lines to them. So there were proposals to build a rapid transit system that was 10 times the cost of the first subway, which was $35 million. That is to say, this expanded system was estimated to cost $350 million in 1913 dollars, which is about $22 billion if you use the construction cost index in current dollars, although really, if you really wanted to rebuild all the lines now, it would probably cost you between $150 and $200 billion. So we're talking a big plan here. Again, there was another battle as to how to do this, and the end result was a compromise that was made with the two companies, the IRT and the BRT, to expand the network of the IRT to include two trunk lines, the 7th Avenue line and the Lexington Avenue line in Manhattan, and a number of feeder lines from the Bronx and Brooklyn, and then a new line, the Flushing line, that would come in from Queens. Actually, the Flushing and Astoria line were jointly operated by the BRT. And the BRT would get a whole bunch of new lines in southern Brooklyn that would all come in over the Manhattan Bridge and through a tunnel under the East River up and go up Broadway. So Broadway would be the trunk line for the BRT, and it would carry all the traffic from the Brooklyn lines as well as from the lines in Queens that would tie into it via the 60th Street Tunnel. Well, that plan was very successful. Again, it was a fully funded plan. Most of the money was put up by the city of New York. The city owned the system of both the IRT and the BRT, but they had 50-year leases to operate it, again, at a 5-cent fare that was fixed in the contracts. These lines were extremely important, probably the most well, I wrote a book about it, so I love to talk about it. But it was probably the biggest single public works project that was ever done in New York City, and the most important one, more than anything that Robert Moses ever did, and at least any single project. Because what these subways did was they really made possible the growth of Midtown Manhattan as the nation's largest central business district, which it is in terms of square footage. And they also maintained the viability of Lower Manhattan as a business district. So for the development of Manhattan's economy, they were critical, but perhaps even more importantly, and this is not often realized, these new subway lines, which were built to new open land in the outer boroughs, where developers then went and built a very different mixture of housing than the old tenement buildings in places like the Lower East Side, allowed average working people at no increase in cost, according to Marion Casey, who's a historian of Irish Americans in New York City. That is to say, a working family living on Hell's Kitchen on the West 40s could move to Fordham in the Bronx from a 3-bedroom crappy tenement apartment to a 5-room apartment in Fordham and pay the same price. So it allowed people to move out, and in fact, all of New York's population growth between 1910 and 1940 is in those lines, the subway suburbs opened by the dual system. Following the dual system, there was a big battle over that. It's too complicated to talk about now. William Randolph Hearst got involved. He was the biggest publisher in New York at the time. He got a man named John Francis Hyland elected mayor in 1917, who insisted that any new subways be built independent of the city-owned lines, but privately operated lines, run by the IRT and the BMT. And as a result of that political battle, we got the 1924 IND Plan, which did open some new territory in Queens, the Queens Boulevard line, but which was largely intended to replace a lot of the old elevated lines, like the 6th Avenue L and the 9th Avenue L in Manhattan. Well, all of those lines were also funded, although a second stage plan for the IND approved in 1929 was cut out completely because of the financial crisis caused by the Great Depression, which also caused the IRT to go into bankruptcy. And there were discussions in the 30s to the point where at the same year, 1940, that the last major piece of the existing subway system opened, the 6th Avenue subway, all of the lines came under the control of the city of New York. The city bought out the operating rights of the IRT and the BMT. So since 1940, the subway has been operated as a unity. But the main thing is that in every stage of this thing, there was a battle that went on for over 10 years as to how to build a system. There was a debate as to where the line should go. There was some debate about the extent of the system, sort of things that Jeff Zupan is going to talk about later in terms of dealing with issues in the 21st century. But all of those issues were taken care of eventually, and we got the world's largest system in terms of tens of track miles. And so it was a major accomplishment, especially given the fact that since 1940, with only a few additions, we haven't really built anything. And that's unlike almost every other major world city. In fact, it's unlike any other major world city like London, Paris, Tokyo, Moscow that I can think of. Since the 1940s, we've had a problem where operating costs go up every year, and for a long time, ridership was going down. So the fare, which had remained at 5 cents until 1948, was raised to 10 cents then, and then in 1953 it was raised to 15 cents by a new agency called the New York City Transit Authority, which was intended sort of to take the subway out of politics, but it didn't really. But you get the idea of what politicians could do. Current mayor was quoted in the New York Times this morning. Mayor Wagner ran for mayor in 1953 on the slogan, "New York needs more than a token mayor," the token being created when the fare went to 15 cents and you had to have some coin to do it. So the mayors have made the fare issue an issue since Hyland was mayor in 1917, or actually came in office in 1918. The idea of the Transit Authority was that the subway would cover all of its operating costs out of the fare box. And that the city would take care of all the capital needs of the subway system. Well, that didn't work. Ridership was going down, operating costs were going up. The fare had to go up in the 50s and then again in the 60s, to the point where everybody accepts by the 60s that the city should start subsidizing operating expenses, and then by the 1970s, the state and the federal government get involved in subsidizing operations of the subway system. At the same time, the city and the other levels of government never provided enough money for the system to expand. So the Great Second Avenue Subway, which was a key part of the IND 1929 plan, and for which the Second Avenue and Third Avenue Ls on the east side were torn down, was never built. And everybody thinks that was some type of conspiracy, but the reality was that the people running the transit authority in 1953 and 1954 decided that they needed to use the money for what? To keep up the existing system, to buy replacement subway cars, to replace the signal system. So the money was used for capital renewal rather than to build a new system, with the idea that if you can't keep going what you got, you can't build any new lines. Sort of where we were in 1980 and where we might be again here in 2004. So basically, they made the decision then to put it off. But then, because the state, the financial crisis keeps on continuing, and Governor Rockefeller is governor in the 60s, and he is one of the empire builders of the city and the state, he decides that he's going to take over the transit system. He creates an agency called the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, which takes over the New York City Transit Authority, as well as the Long Island Railroad, and what later became Metro-North Railroad, as well as a cash cow called the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority, which Robert Moses had created to fund the operating deficits of the subway and commuter rail system. And Ronan has a big plan. He thinks he can keep the fare stable, or at least reasonable, maybe with small increases. He thinks he has the money to keep the system going, and he expects large amounts of new funding from the state through bond issues and from the federal government. And that's his mistake, because the state bond issues, one was approved, but two weren't approved, and the federal government never provided enough money in the 1970s to even do more than 3 little pieces of the Second Avenue subway. Although a new line was built to Queens under the East River and across 63rd Street and under the East River, a first stage of a massive expansion to Queens. The Ronan plan called for the Second Avenue subway and new lines in the outer parts of Queens, which would come through on a high-speed line to Long Island City and then would pass into Manhattan across 63rd Street. All of those plans have to be canceled at the end of the 70s. By Chairman Ravitch, actually, because the money isn't there in the 70s because of the city and state fiscal crisis, not just to keep the existing, not to build new lines, but even to keep the existing system going. To the point that by the late 1970s, early 1980s, trains are literally falling off the subway tracks every day. And the failure rate is like 7,000 miles compared to the new cars that they have. That's just cars taken out of service every 7,000 miles. The number on the new cars on the subway system is over 1 million miles.
2 minutes, Peter.
2 minutes, okay. Well, so you have this financing issue that Ravitch inherits. And when he became chairman, he came, as I think the introductory piece also already said, he came up with a financial plan to fix the existing system, the first 5-year capital plan, a number of new, innovative, creative financing mechanisms. Those mechanisms were successful. They quadrupled the amount of capital money to about $1.2 billion to $1.5 billion a year to spend on the renewal of the existing system. That first capital plan was a success. It was repeated by 2 successive other capital plans, and actually by now the 4th and a half, actually they changed the years at one point. But we've had 5-year plans that have spent up to now $45 billion replacing the parts and the subway, the signals, the tracks, buying new subway cars, as well as the commuter rail system, as well as the bus system. So much so that by the 90s, the MTA felt successful enough that it was going to start talking about whether we should expand the system, because it's obvious that there are major problems that Jeff will talk about on the existing system that don't meet the needs of the people. So every one of the 5-year plans since Chairman Ravitch has been here have been put together largely with one-shot financial mechanisms that can't repeat themselves, the last one being bonding out of the fare box. We're faced with the same situation, sort of, that we were in 1968 or 1980, which is say, how do you get the money to operate the system properly, and what should the rider pay? The rider now pays about 60 to 65% of the cost of a subway ride. Where does the money come, mostly, almost all from taxes, to pay the $17 billion that the MTA says it needs just to keep the existing system going, not just the subway, but the bus and the commuter rail system. And if we want to spend another $10 billion in the next 5 years building the Second Avenue subway and building a Long Island Railroad access to Grand Central, where will that money come from? As all of you who've read the New York Times, as well as the Daily News and the New York Post in the last 2 weeks know, the money isn't there. No one knows where the money is coming from, and maybe Chairman Ravitch can tell us where he thinks it might come from. So that's my piece. Thank you.
Thank you. Robert Snyder.
Thanks very much. Thanks for coming out. I have to confess that I have a connection to the transit system that Mike didn't mention. My grandfather was a transit worker from 1918 to 1966. And for me, this destroys any kind of professional detachment that I might have about it otherwise. I'm excited about what Grandpa did for a living, and I think that transit workers like him play a vitally important role in the life of the city, and we'll come back to that in a few minutes. Not only is the transit system the biggest subway system in the United States of America, but it's also a big theme in the life and history of New York City. You look at the city's politics, you look at the history of its real estate, you look at its arts, you look at the history of its neighborhoods, you look at the growth of its ethnic communities, and in all of these, you see that the subway system plays a very major role. I want to focus on 3 of them in the 15 minutes that I have tonight. One is creating our identities as New Yorkers, as inhabitants of a whole city of 5 boroughs, and also as inhabitants of very small neighborhoods of only a few blocks square. It's the importance of the subway system in creating our identities as New Yorkers, I think, that helps explain why the crisis in service and fear of crime that rocked the subways from the late 50s into the 1990s became so important in the life of the city. So important not only in the everyday lives of citizens, but also in the politics of the city and the popular culture of how New York and its subways were represented on film. And finally, the subway system, I think, is important in the lives of everyday New Yorkers because transit workers themselves, ordinary men and women like you and me, play a vital role in keeping the system running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it is that 24-hour transit system that we take for granted that enables New York City to run as a 24-hour city and as a world capital. First, then, on the metropolitan identities fostered by the transit system. One of the most fascinating things about New York City is that all of us who live there are residents of both the biggest city in the United States and very small neighborhoods, often only a few blocks square, where we all know faces on the street and signs in the store windows. We can thank the subway system often for both of these. Subways connect distant regions of the city to each other, making it possible for New Yorkers to enjoy all the benefits, educational, economic, and cultural that the city has to offer. There's a book about 19th century France called Peasants into Frenchmen, and it talks about how people living in isolated corners of the country that we now think of as France gained a common identity as Frenchmen through all sorts of cultural and political means. Well, the subway system plays that kind of role in the city of New York. It turns Inwoodites, Brooklynites, and Astorians into New Yorkers who have things in common. A student from Eastern Queens can ride on the subway to attend Stuyvesant High School in Lower Manhattan. An office worker in the North Bronx can commute to a job in Midtown. Kids from crowded neighborhoods in Brooklyn can take the subway to the beaches of Coney Island. And an immigrant from the Lower East Side can find his or her way to the kinds of books that can change your life at the New York Public Library on 42nd Street. New York has, unlike many of the newer cities of the Sun Belt, an extraordinary density of public institutions that enriched lives for all sorts of people, natives and newcomers, rich and poor. The subway puts them in reach of all of them, despite the great geographic distances between the furthest parts of Brooklyn and Queens and Midtown Manhattan. So in that sense, it gives New Yorkers who live in far corners of the city the possibility of sharing in all the resources of the metropolis. At the same time, the subway is responsible for many of the neighborhoods that most New Yorkers call home. The opening of the subway 100 years ago, followed by the creation of the dual system described so ably by Peter, and the construction of the IND opened up all sorts of new neighborhoods for residential development. These were the neighborhoods that the children of immigrants who came here in the early years of the 20th century came to call home. And life in those then new neighborhoods in New York City, like Inwood in northern Manhattan, like Brownsville in Brooklyn, became the subject of some of the most memorable writing produced about neighborhood life in New York City. Think of Alfred Kazan's book about Brownsville, A Walker in the City. Think of Kate Simon's book about the Bronx. At the same time, the subway, by the 20s and 30s, had acquired a status as one of the symbols, one of the images of New York City. There was a sense that there was something about the subway and traveling on the subway that was essential to the life of New Yorkers. John Sloan, a painter in the early years of the 20th century, depicted the L's of Manhattan. Reginald Marsh went on to do great drawings and sketches of life on the subway trains. Also, Walker Evans, the great photographer, took a memorable series of portraits of New Yorkers, snapped candidly just across the aisle, that have both great dignity of ordinary people and sort of the randomness of city life, of the incredible array of people that you can find yourself across from on a New York City subway car. Also, we think of Times Square as a great center of culture and theater and having a good time on Saturday night. Well, as the subways crept out into New York City, the major subway stations in the boroughs themselves became stops that were the center of commercial districts. Think of the Hub in the Bronx, West 96th Street in Manhattan, 181st Street in Broadway and Washington Heights. All those neighborhoods had first vaudeville houses and then big motion picture palaces that brought first vaudeville and then major films to easy reach of ordinary people living lives throughout New York City. It wasn't all sweetness and light in these new neighborhoods that emerged in the years between World War I and World War II. There could be ethnic conflict, for example, between the Irish and the Jews in Washington Heights in the 1930s. If the subway itself was integrated as to ridership, there was still a problem with racial segregation in housing. And the transit workforce itself was not integrated until activist measures by union members and their supporters in the 1930s and 1940s. And it all wasn't perfect. Obviously, some of the limits of that system that were built in those years are still with us today. It's still hard to get to Midtown Manhattan from some parts, for example, of distant Queens, and that still needs to be improved on. Still, the subway became a very valuable part of life in the first half of the 20th century. And we recognized that most acutely when the system began to deteriorate and fear of crime rose in the subways, scaring many riders from the late 1950s until the reductions of crime in the 1990s. To be accurate, the subways were often safer than the streets above, but the fear on the subways reflected the larger fear of crime in the city. Subways for most New Yorkers who rode them to work or to visit family or friends were an unavoidable part of life. So if you were harmed there, or if you were threatened there, you very often had to go back down to the same train, back down to the same station where you had felt endangered just a day before. There was really no getting away from it, and that kind of fear became very spooky for many people. Brendan Behan, the Irish writer who spent a lot of time in New York, once said that you can judge the health of a city by the ease that we feel among strangers. By the 1960s, the 1970s, and 80s, the subways had become a very uneasy place for many New Yorkers. Think of the difference between the way the subway is portrayed in the movie On the Town, which came out in 1949 and depicts sailors so happily riding around town in pursuit of a good time, and the way the city subways were depicted in The Incident, which came out in 1967, a film about a gang that terrorizes a crowd full of subway passengers until an injured soldier gives his life trying to rescue them. Think forward then to the taking of Pelham 123 in 1974 and its depiction of a very sinister hostage-taking on the New York subway system. Disorder, epitomized by graffiti, was as much a problem as the violence itself on the subways by the 1970s and 1980s. And a lot of this sense of unease was confounded by what you saw or read in the newspaper, culminating, I think, in the case of Bernie Goetz and his vigilante shootings in 1984 that seemed to me to mark a kind of low point in our sense of the subways as something that belonged to all of us as New Yorkers in safety, that we could ride in security. Since then, the situation has vastly improved, not only with regard to service, but also with regard to safety on the subways. That's part of, I think, innovative policing strategies that were introduced on the subway system in the 1990s, and also a larger reduction in crime that I think has made life in the city much better than it was in the late 1980s and years preceding that. All of this then directs our attention to the third point that I want to talk about briefly tonight, is the transit workers, the people who make the city run. Because these are people who are seen by all New Yorkers as they ride the subway, as they get on a bus, but little known except to their families and friends. Transit workers have their own work routines. They work odd hours in a 24-hour system. They have their own language, which I learned to speak working on the book Transit Talk. For example, they'll talk about reading the iron, looking at the alignment of tracks and switches on a subway track so you know which way a train is going to go even before it reaches that juncture in the track. They'll talk about the structure. The structure is really the elevated track and the stations that are up there with them. And they'll talk about things like a 12-9, a person who falls under a train, either by accident or suicide. And certainly a 12-9 is one of the most traumatic things that can happen to a transit worker. There's been a fair bit of journalism about transit workers that's worth taking seriously. Dennis Duggan and Jim Dwyer both pioneered a Subways column in the pages of New York Newsday, and Randy Kennedy's collection of New York Times columns on transit workers has just come out. One of the institutions, of course, that's most important to reckon with in the history of transit in New York City and the lives of transit workers is Local 100 of the Transport Workers Union, certified in 1937. Before that, my grandfather worked 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. Once when the union was voted in, there's a story that I remembered researching in the book Transit Talk about transit workers, and a supervisor at a transit yard was talking to a transit worker and said, I don't know how you could sign up for this hot-headed Mike Quill. How could you sign up for this hot-headed union with Mike Quill? I don't get it. You look like a sensible man, Johnny. And Johnny looked at his boss and said, Mr. Johnson, the way you treated the men in the yard year in and year out, you were the best organizers on the property. You were the ones who made me want to join the transit union, not Mike Quill. And with 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, there's no surprise in that. Under Quill, in an industrial city with a strong union movement, the Transit Workers Union was a significant force in the life of the city. But for all its presence, it staged two major strikes under Quill in 1966, and then again under John Law in 1980. Having said all that, the Transit Workers Union is not as strong a force, I think, as it was in those early years, primarily because the labor movement in the city has diminished in terms of its clout compared to what it had in the 40s and 50s. Nonetheless, transit workers, I think, live better lives because they have a union, and they live and work in a very difficult system that's difficult to understand for outsiders. And I can think of three characteristics that became very clear to me working on the book Transit Talk. One is they work in the middle of a system that embodies elements of the past and the present. Pieces of track work that you do in the subway system are interchangeable with hard manual labor inherited from the 19th century. At the same time, the systems used to align the tracks can use computers that are part of the 21st century. Transit workers work in an industrial system with dangerous machinery all around them, yet if you're a conductor on a subway train, you're expected to maintain a pleasant demeanor for your passengers. Conductors, on the other hand, talk all the time about being slapped, spit at, hit, punched, having things thrown at them by subway riders who are angry at the system for one way or another, but can take it only out on the conductor who is leaning out of a subway car. Finally, as Paul Fussell, the literary scholar, wrote once, there are really only two classes of people, the people who can die on the job and the people who won't. Transit workers do die on the job. According to Local 100, since 1947, 210 transit workers have died on the job, and we should think seriously about the dangers that they face, both from moving machinery and from the electricity of the 600 volts that runs alongside the tracks. If the subway makes a difference in the lives of New Yorkers, transit workers make the subway run. The energy and enterprise of our city are in significant measure their creation. They deserve our respect and gratitude. The revival of the subway in recent years, with better service, better safety for all riders, has given back to our whole city something precious, something that we hold in common. We want to hang on to that. We don't want to lose that. The subway is an important force in the lives of all New Yorkers. Thank you.
Thank you. Jeffrey Zupan.
Good evening. The current grim financial news may make you think that it renders this part of the program moot. And it is my job to tell you that it is not moot, but if you allow yourselves to think that it is moot, it surely will be. No, this wasn't written by Yogi Berra. Is there anyone in this auditorium who thinks that New York City could possibly have grown and prospered the way it has without its subway system? And further, if the subway system was not in condition to continue to attract riders in the future, that New York City or this region could survive economically? It is instructive to look at a little history, and I won't go over too much of what we've gone over before, but measured by the ridership on the subway system. We haven't really talked about how many people use it. Subway ridership topped out in 1946, before auto ownership was ubiquitous and before the flight to the suburbs that followed World War II. There was a steady decline until the 1990s, but now ridership levels have returned to what they were 50 years ago. For reference, I call your attention to the handout chart I have on subway ridership. I can make available to you. This has been quite an achievement when you think about the suburbanization of the region during this time. You have already heard a bit as to why this has happened, and I will speak further about this in a moment. But what about the physical system itself? We built about 200 miles of tunnel and at-grade subway between 1904 and 1938, about 6 miles of new subway lines per year. I repeat, 6 miles of new subway lines per year. The subway system's extent reached its zenith in 1938. In contrast, we have been shrinking the subway system ever since, tearing down 55 miles of elevated line, including the 2nd, 3rd, 6th, 9th Avenue L's, plus 4 lines in Brooklyn, while adding only about 10 miles of subway tunnel. During this period of shrinkage, we also stopped investing in what was left. You all know this history, which reached its nadir about 1980. Then Richard Ravitch and later Bob Kiley stepped in. The result was $45 billion plus in investments, raised through taxes. You all remember that word. Now about 2/3 of the system has been brought up to a state of good repair, and we are now moving into normal replacement cycles in many areas. There was little or no expansion from 1940 until the late 60s, when the newly formed MTA proposed the grand design, intended to build about 50 miles of new subway and a Long Island Railroad terminal on the east side at 3rd Avenue. These were started and literally stopped in their tracks during the city's financial crisis of the early 70s, with only unusable or underusable, that's a new word I invented, underusable subway segments built. After that, starting around 1980, any investments were rightfully put towards fixing the sorry state of the existing system. By the early 90s, as the system started to recover, the MTA began to resurrect the expansion plans. New studies were done, which led to the commitment to build the 2nd Avenue subway from 125th Street to the Battery, and the Long Island Railroad's East Side Access Project to connect that commuter rail system to Grand Central Terminal, not to 3rd Avenue. Each was part of the MTA's grand design. 2 other expansion projects, not as far along, have now emerged, each the product of new objectives: the extension of the number 7 Flushing line to the far west side to assist the city's plans for development of that area, and a new tunnel under the East River to Lower Manhattan, intended to connect Long Island Railroad riders more directly to Lower Manhattan in an attempt to strengthen Lower Manhattan's competitive position after 9/11. Now that you're up to date, having brought you through the last 100 years in about 5 minutes, what about the future for the next 20, 30, 50, or even 100 years? First, when considering expansion or other significant changes in the network, what criteria should we use? I propose the following: coverage, capacity, connectivity, speed, and collectively something I call, couldn't think of a better word, combination, amenity, convenience, and attractiveness. All those little things that make you want to come in rather than repel you. More on each in a moment. Second, we should not be thinking about the future of the subway system oblivious to what might be done to improve other forms of public transportation, including commuter rail, light rail, bus, ferry, all of which can contribute to meeting one or more of the attributes listed above. Third, we cannot ignore the fact that our present public officials have not yet understood what their predecessors, both 100 years ago and then 25 years ago, clearly understood: that it is imperative for the economy of this city and this state, I repeat, this state, that the subway system be expanded and kept in good shape and be continually reconstituted to meet new needs, and that means money. But let's get back to the fiscal improvements for now. In the interest of time, I'll do this in a somewhat shorthanded fashion, and organized around the different attributes that I described earlier. Problem, with attributes, problem, same thing. The problem, lack of coverage, that is, not being within walking distance of a subway stop. For southeastern Queens, the conversion of the Atlantic Branch to a super subway. See RPA's Metrolink proposal. I suggest you go to our website, rpa.org. For the Bronx, the extension of the 2nd Avenue subway through the South Central Bronx and over Amtrak's right-of-way to Co-op City, also Amtrak, RPA's proposal. For the Upper East Side of Manhattan, the completion of the 2nd Avenue subway. For East Flatbush in Brooklyn, the Utica Avenue subway extension. For the Lower East Side, the branch off 2nd Avenue subway. See RPA's proposal again. For the Brooklyn waterfront, not subways, ferries and/or express buses from Red Hook and ferries from Greenpoint. Subways don't always do the job. For northeastern Queens, could be helped with the Long Island Railroad East Side Access project, that connection to Grand Central, by offering more and better service in that part of Queens. Second problem area, capacity. Read this as overcrowding. On the Lexington Avenue line, obviously the most overcrowded line, build the 2nd Avenue subway. For Penn Station and crowding on Queens Boulevard subway, construct the Long Island Railroad East Side Access project, adding 24 peak-hour commuter trains to the 36 that now come in from Long Island and eastern Queens. And for Queens Boulevard, plan a high-speed bypass to Jamaica. Penn Station access from the west, that's called New Jersey. Construct a new commuter rail tunnel to the east and west side of Manhattan, to the east and west side of Manhattan. See our proposal, the case for a new passenger rail tunnel under the Hudson River. For capacity on the entire subway system, install the communications-based train control system, which will also increase speed and improve reliability. That's across the board. Next problem, lack of connectivity, and this is something that's often forgotten. That is to solve the problem with selective transfers and extensions to make the system that we have fit better. Broadway Lafayette Bleecker transfer in Manhattan, the Lawrence J. Street transfer at Metrotech in Brooklyn, the EVG combination in Long Island City, Broadway Lorimer in Brooklyn, Queens Plaza, Queensboro Plaza. That's in Queens, in case you didn't realize that. Livonia and Junius Avenues in Brooklyn to connect the number 3 and the L lines, and all 6 possible 2nd Avenue subway transfers at 125th, 53rd, 42nd, 14th, Houston, Grand, that are under consideration now, and one added one possibly where the JMZ crosses the Bowery Station. Crosses the 2nd Avenue subway at the Bowery Station. There are also extensions that add to connectivity. The 2nd Avenue subway again, extended across 125th Street to the west of Broadway, create tremendous amount of connectivity north, south, east, and west. Also the 2nd Avenue subway under the East River. It's going to be built pointing towards Brooklyn to make it easier for movements between Brooklyn and the east side of Manhattan. You might notice there's a theme here. The Second Avenue subway keeps coming up as serving multiple objectives for multiple markets throughout the city. This is not just about the Upper East Side. And the new tunnels that make connections much better. The Long Island Railroad East Side Access Project to save up to 3/4 of an hour for travelers to the East Midtown from Long Island and Eastern Queens by eliminating transfers at Penn Station and speeding the trip and connecting the entire Metro North system to the entire Long Island Railroad system, beginning to unite the region. The new Hudson River Tunnel extended to East Midtown using the RPA loop concept, read all about it in our website, providing access to the rest of Midtown Manhattan and speeding the trip. The new East River Tunnel to Lower Manhattan, connecting to the Second Avenue subway again, and possibly to the E-train near the World Trade Center. Metro North service to Penn Station from the New Haven and Hudson lines once the East Side access clears out enough trains for you to enable you to do that. Another theme here, East Long Island Railroad, East Side Access Project, keeps coming up, again, for multiple benefits to multiple markets throughout the New York region. Next problem, slow service, especially from the outer portions of the boroughs. For the Rockaways, anybody here from the Rockaways? How long did it take you to get here today? Too long, right? Okay. Connect to Atlantic Avenue branch of the Long Island Railroad once it is converted to a super subway. Also, a subsidized ferry service from Jacob Riis Park. For the eastern portions of the Bronx, replace the slow and curved southern portions of the White Plains Road line. For Eastern Queens, the high-speed bypass again. For Staten Island, any here from Staten Island, anybody? Well, have I got a plan for you? More extensive express buses with exclusive lane on the Staten Island Expressway and on the rebuilt Gowanus Expressway, preferably as a tunnel to help the blighted areas of those blighted areas of Brooklyn. The densities and costs do not warrant a subway extension to Staten Island. Sorry, Staten Island. Subway just doesn't make sense all the way out there. But there are SIRT improvements that I could go into. Staten Island should have high-speed ferries from St. George and elsewhere. For the entire city, a network of higher-speed buses incorporating features of low-floor buses, proof of payment using smart card technology, and selective exclusive rights-of-way for preferential treatment, and believe it or not, teaching New Yorkers to exit from the back of the bus through a redesigned door that makes it possible to do that without being a contortionist and take your life in your hands. I'm getting old too. Problem, lack of amenity, convenience, and attractiveness. Selective replacement of more ancient elevated lines, the most ancient elevated lines, with subways where subway service improvements also could be created. Not just do it for the replacement, but do it where you can also incorporate other improvements as well. RPA's report, the framework for transit planning in the New York region, outlined those. The completion of the subway station rehabilitation program with more attention to reconstructing the stations for better connectivity underground and better integration with the above ground, especially to encourage development in the station area, rather than just the cosmetic changes we see now. A regional and universal smart card, real-time train arrival information. This is a long list and will require a lot of money, but when viewed from the long-term perspective and from its value to New York City and New York State, we cannot afford to turn our back on our future. If we do, surely our citizens will look back at us and say, what were they thinking in 2004 when they sacrificed state of good repair and normal replacement cycles and did not invest for changing needs, allowing the system and our economy to stagnate? I don't know if anyone's ever going to say that exactly, but they will say, what were they thinking? Recently, RPA issued a report on some of the options for financing the capital program and of the MTA and filling its funding gap. Again, look at our website. Includes, among other things, 2 dirty words, tolls and taxes. I remind you that New York has never been a cheap place to live, work, or play in, but it is a special place despite its high costs. But if we allow our 100-year-old subway and the rest of our transit system to wither from lack of investment and neither upgrade or expand it, we will surely be presiding over a place that is neither special or worth living in, working in, or playing in. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Richard Ravitch.
tell you, I wish these three gentlemen had been speaking out publicly 25 years ago. It made my job easier. When I resigned as chairman of the MTA over 20 years ago, about 20 years ago, I thought that the last thing I was going to do was to speak out on the subject publicly, because when I was there working very, very hard, I resented the kibitzers and the second guessers because they didn't know what they were talking about. And I thought it was tasteless for me to open my big fat mouth and start commenting on it again. But I've decided this year to break my promise to myself, and I am speaking out, because I think what the political system is doing to the public transportation system in this city is unacceptable. And I couldn't live with myself if I didn't say so. There are obvious reasons why politicians don't like to deal with physical infrastructure problems of the size and scope that this subway system represents. First of all, it means higher taxes or higher user charges of some kind or another. And that, particularly in the last few years, seems to be a no-no for people who get elected to high office in New York City and state and in Washington. Second of all, because generally the commitment or contractual commitment to a major public expenditure doesn't produce a visible result until the politician's no longer holding office. So he says, if I'm not there to get the benefit of this public expenditure, it's probably not as important as spending money on things that have a visible effect on the voting public within my term of office or when I run for office again. Third of all, because our society, perhaps because we've been so fortunate and so rich, has always, or never I should say, addressed the fundamentals of any problem until the fundamentals were in total disarray. Think about it, the major crises, I'm not talking about the external ones, the Civil Rights Revolution, the injustices were known, were growing for many, many years. In 1963, when the famous Civil Rights March occurred, President of the United States didn't feel it was politically appropriate for him to even participate in that march. And of course, subsequently, when the problem reached such enormous proportions, when kids were being murdered and slaughtered and buried in swamps, the political system finally responded. I could give you many other illustrations. There are 15 million American families today who are paying more than 50% of their income for shelter. But it's not a crisis. It's not a collapse of a system, and therefore the political system isn't addressing it. Well, specifically with respect to the MTA, when I said in 1980, and I should explain very briefly that I'm a lawyer and a businessman and got involved at the request of the governor in public service in '75 when a lot of the state agencies in the city of New York were in fiscal difficulty, and it was a marvelously satisfying, useful way to spend a period of my life. And I did not expect that a few years later the governor would ask me to be chairman of the MTA. I'd used this subway all my life. I grew up in the shadow of the 9th Avenue L, which was torn down when I was 7 years old, and took the subway to school every day of my life, and continued to take it to work. And I knew that it was becoming a serious, serious liability for this city, because it was the unreliability of it and the filth and the a number of breakdowns, and the ancient equipment, I mean, it was patently obvious to everybody, and the public was up in arms. And the media loved to report because it was visual, and television, being the dominant media, unfortunately, liked things that were visual, and therefore, every other day there was a story about a fire in the subway or a subway delay or a breakdown in which hundreds of people were sitting and contained in a subway car underground. And the public was outraged. And I didn't really know quite what I was getting into, but one of the first things I did was had to confront a strike. Transit workers hadn't received an increase in 5 years. The rate of inflation had increased significantly, and I was delighted to hear what Mr. Snyder said. The question that I faced was the city of New York was still in fiscally very perilous times. The mayor was trying to restore fiscal balance to the city of New York by both holding down costs as well as dealing where he had to with revenue increases. And it was very much in his interest, or the city's interest as he saw it, that the transit workers not receive too large a wage increase, lest that set a precedent that would thrust the city once again into insolvency. And yet I had the responsibility of running a transit system, and it depends, as was pointed out to you, largely on the work that 45,000 hourly rated employees perform every day on that system. Without their interest and their motivation and their hard work, this system could never function properly. And I felt I was as responsible for them as I was to the people who appointed me, the legislators that appropriated money. And yet we had to deal with a conflict. There was a strike. There wasn't a strike because the head of the TWU and I couldn't agree. We agreed on what the deal should be. The problem was that I couldn't get the mayor to agree with a level of compensation that I thought was fair and appropriate, and he couldn't get half his union to agree to a level of compensation that he thought was a fair compromise under the circumstances. So we sat in the hotel for 10 days while the public suffered, and before finally the atmosphere was so acute that the matter was settled. And I tell you this story because I learned more about the transit system in those 10 days with the people from the Transit Workers Union than I ever learned from anybody else. And as a result of the bond that was created during that, in an ironic sense, they became invaluable help to me politically in getting done what I had to get done. Because, for example, when I subsequently decided that it was economically sound to buy subway cars manufactured abroad and to get credit financing from the foreign countries, in particular Canada, Japan, and France, to finance those subway cars, there was an understandable outrage on the part of people who thought we ought to be buying American. But for the support of the TWU, I don't know what the political outcome of that was, but I was hauled before congressional committees accused of not caring about my country, but it was the support I got from the union that ultimately gave political credibility to an economic event, which I'm proud to say saved the taxpayers and fare payers about $600 million, and that was real money in those days. Okay, so here we are in 2004, and the MTA has said that they need $17 billion for the next 5 years to maintain this system in a state of good repair. In 1980, I said, after analyzing the system through detailed discussions with the engineers of the railroads and the subway system and the bus system, that we needed $15 billion. And I described in some detail how what the useful life of all the component parts of the subway system were and what the replacement cost would be, and explained that we'd been spending about 1/100th of what one would ordinarily spend on the most essential and vital part of the system. Was a critical issue for New York, and they wrote full-page editorials demanding that the political system address this issue. And until they wrote that, the politicians paid no attention. After they wrote what they wrote, and Newsday was equally vigorous on the subject, the political system paid attention. Problem number one, there is no indignation coming out of the media today about this problem, and no willingness to face up to the fact that the business community should be supporting the increase in revenues necessary to maintain this system in a state of good repair. Two, segue, business community. Business community, of which I've been a part all my life, lacks the leadership today to address this issue in a direct and frontal fashion. When I proposed tax increases to get the revenues for the MTA, I called up, I've never said this publicly either, I called up David Rockefeller, who was chairman of the Chase Bank, who I barely knew. Matter of fact, I don't think I'd ever met anybody higher than the vice president of the local branch before, and I asked him if he, I said, this is a very audacious request, Mr. Rockefeller, but would you be willing to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and let me show you how the subway system unfurls, let me show you the repair facilities, let me show you the conditions under which the workers are working. And he said, absolutely, I'd be delighted. And he invited a couple of the other major business leaders in New York, and indeed took them up to 242nd Street, and we rode down in the system, and I showed them the yards at 207th Street, showed them the locker rooms where the transit workers change their clothes, which I think appalled them more than anything else, because they were very conscious of the fact that to get efficiency, you have to treat your employees well, and these transit workers had not been treated well. So I can't prove this, but I believe that they all called the Republican leadership in the legislature and said, pass Ravitch's tax package, and they did. That was when business leadership used their clout for public purposes as well as to advance their own individual or industrial interests. Three, in 1980, we could only assert the proposition that an improved system would produce more ridership and therefore more revenue. I couldn't prove it historically. I could only argue and have academic analyses about the elasticity of the fare and the elasticity of the ridership. But history, as Jeff pointed out, has demonstrated that if you improve the system, you will get more people to ride it. And if you get more people to ride it, you'll get more revenue. In those days, about 50% of the cost of the system was borne by the riders and 50% through public subsidies. That's now is almost 65%, am I correct, of the burden being on the rider. This is a very legitimate public debate to occur. How much should be borne by each? Do the taxpayers benefit by the existence of the subway? Obviously they do. Can you imagine this city functioning without the subway system moving over, what, 3 million people a day? 4.5, thank you. Shows you how old I am. Can you imagine it? I mean, it is so integral to the survival of this city that it's a legitimate public debate. How much should the rider pay? How much should the taxpayers pay? And then which group of taxpayers? The taxpayers in New York City, the taxpayers in New York State, or the taxpayers in the United States of America? Every time I went to Washington to appeal for funds for Congress, they said, why should we pay for the New York City subway system? And I said, New York City is critical. I don't think half the people in Washington recognized that until the tragedy of a few years ago. But New York is integral to the wealth and the prosperity and the well-being of this country. And you pay to subsidize farmers in Iowa. You subsidize trains that move cattle in Kansas. How about the same kind of tax breaks for the Straphangers in New York City? But these are legitimate public debates, and there is none today. Where is this debate occurring? It's not. Where does the public have even the opportunity to engage in a political process in a democracy where they can exercise some preferences for the people they elect to office on the basis of their value systems? And I can't say to you in all honesty that it is written in the skies that 50% is the number, that the city taxpayers ought to pay more than the state taxpayers or the regional taxes, which were enacted in my era, is a better basis for raising revenues for this system. But the truth of the matter is, it can never happen until there's a debate, and like everything else in our marvelous system, it always gets compromised. And some of the cost is borne by the riders, some of it by each group of taxpayer and each group of user.
I think we're going to have to wrap it up.
I'll conclude very simply. The reason I'm speaking out, for whatever utility that serves, is because I believe that if the mayor and the governor and the state legislature and the city council don't address this problem, this system is going to start down the slippery slope again, and we're going to be just where we were in 1979. And that would be a tragedy for the city of New York at a time when this city is thriving. Do you know, and I'll finish with this, that more people moved to New York City in the 1990s than to any city in the United States of America? 900,000 people came here. And I look around this room, and aside from a few other people like myself with gray hair, most of you are young, and I travel around the city a fair amount, and I have kids who live here, and the excitement and the economic activity and the cultural activity that goes on in parts of this city is a marvelous magnet, and it will shrink and die if we don't do something about our mass transit system. Thank you.
All right, we're going to now be joined by three expert questioners, and we will try to advance this discussion and begin this public debate. We have, what we'll do is we'll have them ask one question and then pass the microphone to the next person. Michael Luo, a staff writer at the New York Times, has covered transportation for the paper's Metro desk over the past year. He was recently put on an investigative project, so he had to give up the beat with some sadness. But in his time on the job, he wrote about everything from the art of the Metro card swipe to the incredible array of transit building projects currently competing for attention from lawmakers. Prior to joining the Times, he was a roving national correspondent for the Associated Press. He has also worked at Newsday and the Los Angeles Times. Robert Pasquale currently serves as director of the University Transportation Research Center and is Distinguished Professor of Civil Engineering at the City College of New York. Prior to his tenure at CCNY, he served as Executive Director of the Chicago Transit Authority. He has served on the executive boards of the Transportation Research Board, the Transit Cooperative Research Program, and was chairman of the Transit Standards Council. He has been awarded the United States Department of Transportation Secretary's Medal for Superior Performance. I'm sorry to say that Gene Russianoff has taken ill and will not be able to be with us this evening. As you know, he is the attorney for Nyberg's Straphangers Campaign and is a vocal participant in the public debates. But we are fortunate indeed that at the last minute, Sig Grava, one of the country's leading transportation experts, has agreed to join us. He is a professor of urban planning at Columbia University, a vice president at Parsons Brinkerhoff, and the author, most recently, of Urban Transportation Systems, a leading textbook in the field. Let's start with Michael. And each one of you who talks should grab the mic like that and pull it in front of you. So
maybe I'll ask a question that each of you guys can sort of weigh in on. Maybe if you guys can sort of wrap your minds around this thought of like, who are some of the heroes of the transit system through history? And I'm really interested in the two historians and some of the personalities that might come to mind. But in terms of these two guys here, maybe we could sort of think about, do any of the people who are in the current regime, whether it be Peter Calico, Katie Lapp, or politicians, things like that, could they have that sort of potential for falling into that category down the road?
You know, my instinct is not to answer that question, but I will. I've gotten to know Katie Lapp in the last 6 months. I think she's a first-rate professional, and I think to the extent that this is now in the public domain, that is largely to her credit. I mean, the problems that the MTA has. But I have to say that the board of the MTA should be advising the governor and the mayor and the leaders of the legislature how their needs ought to be met and make suggestions and lobby for the funding that is necessary instead of just announcing needs and sitting back. I don't blame the mayor for saying the city doesn't want to pay for it. I haven't heard anything from the governor whatsoever, which is rather surprising. Why doesn't the MTA tell us how they think it ought to be paid for? I wouldn't have gotten a bloody dime if I hadn't said that. As a matter of fact, again, forgive me if this is self-serving, but I raised the fare at one board meeting twice. One, a fare increase to take effect the next week, and the other a month later, and challenged the legislature to come back into session and appropriate money. Why don't they do something like that? That's part of the leadership crisis that we have. Now, I understand every chairman has a different relationship with the governor, and I can't comment on that, and I don't know the current chairman well enough. He's a perfectly decent person, and I think he is now very vigorously trying to state the case. I just hope in the process he doesn't sell assets at less than market value.
If I can just answer the question, I think we would all be well served if we have had a champion today like we had 25 years ago, the gentleman sitting to my right.
Any other respondents?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned Quill, but I would come back to him. The irony is my grandfather never joined the Transit Workers Union. He thought that he was in the workforce all his life. He thought Quill was a hothead. Quill made every improvement in my grandfather's life, and gave him, a reasonably modest and comfortable standard of living. But he always thought the union members were too militant. He was never for strikes. He was never for vigorous action. But in addition to Quill, who I think really helped transit workers who lived and worked in the most hellish circumstances gain something like a modest American standard of living, you would name him. I would also name the relatively anonymous but utterly heroic African-American bus drivers and subway workers who helped to integrate the transit workforce in the 30s and 40s. To look back at them, and I can't come up with specific names, is to see such utterly extraordinary guys, college graduates, top athletes, people of the first rank, being used to integrate the transit system so no one could claim that the new African-American workers were anything like subpar. Their names are not well known today, but I was utterly amazed to look back at them and see the kind of people who pushed that forward many years ago.
History of Charlie Faulding. That's a name you should. He was one of the
I've got a guy that nobody knows about who has a story insofar as I think that dealing with the transit system and its financial needs is a political issue. And there was a man who in every respect was as big a man as Robert Moses in terms of getting things done in New York, a borough president of Manhattan named George McEnany, who was the father of the dual system. He was a reform Democrat politician who was elected to office in 1909 in a reform slate that basically realized that in order to break the deadlock over subway expansion, the reformers actually had to take over the city government, which in fact they did in an anti-Tammany election in 1909. They didn't win the mayoralty because the reform vote was split three ways there, and Gaynor became mayor, but Gaynor was actually a reform Democrat. But all the other people on the Board of Estimate that decided on the subway were these reform people who had a commitment to trying to break a deadlock that had gone on for over 8 years. As to how to expand the system. And again, this was a guy who, somebody at this table mentioned that you need to have courage in order to get things done, and I think McEnany is this unsung hero that one day I will write the biography of if I ever finish the other 5 books I'm planning on writing.
Robert Pasquale.
Thanks. Dick alluded to when he was at the board of the MTA, and I'd like to just pose the thought that the transportation authorities that were created in the 70s were really meant to meet problems of the 70s. In the largest cities, it was integrating suburban and urban rail. And basically, the big problem, of course, was finding a constant and continuing source of funds for both operating and capital expenses. But I think if we recognize, and I'll pose this as the question, if we recognize that basically the laws that created the MTA Act were not handed down with the 5 books of Moses. They really came in the mid-70s. Is it time now to revisit the whole MTA Act and perhaps restructure it, rethinking should the board be appointed, elected, who appoints it, who elects it, what are the responsibilities of the board, should they have new funding privileges, should we rethink the relationship between the oversight and the operating organizations? Is it time to really revisit all this to see if we need a new structure of agency to meet the needs of 2005 and 2010?
I'll take a crack at that. I've been asked that question a lot over the last 20 years in academic contexts. And I have to tell you, I'm not sure that I think that any change in the structure of governance would make any difference. I think, number one, and that you really have to look at this as a region. It's complicated in New York because of New Jersey and the fact that the Port Authority is a separate institution and separately governed. But taking what we have, and we only have jurisdiction over New York here, yes, I think regional taxes is probably the soundest way to finance this public transportation system. And I think the only way you ever got any money was if you addressed the problem of the commuter railroads in some reasonable proportion to the problem that you addressed the New York City subway system. So I didn't answer the question before, but I have said that I think the commuter tax ought to be restored and it ought to be a source of revenue for the transportation system in this region. And I believe a tax on a gallon of gasoline sold in this region a 5-cent tax, and I would defy anybody in the course of a month where you've paid as much as a 50-cent differential in the cost of a gallon of gasoline would even notice what taxes they were paying, but that would create a stream of revenue that would be sufficient to meet the MTA's needs in the next 5 years. As examples. Now, there are a lot of other possible taxes, and that's what we should be talking about, not whether the need exists, and not who's going to be holding the tar baby when the music stops. That's what we ought to be talking about. And I don't think the structure, change in the structure can change anything. It's good to have an independent body, because it does enable the governor and the mayor to insulate themselves, which they want to do for political purposes, so they can blame the fare increase on people who hold the job I held. And that's fine. You take that job fully willing to accept the responsibility and sometimes the anger of the public when you raise fares. And it's interesting to see all the comments that the politicians today are making about the MTA. It's almost verbatim what the governor and the mayor said 20 years ago. I even wondered whether Mayor Bloomberg pulled out Ed Koch's speech of 1981. I'm not saying that they're wrong to question efficiency, and I have no idea what the MTA's done in recent years, but I can tell you, because I checked today on the phone, there's essentially the same number of employees in the central headquarters of the MTA today as there were when the current deputy mayor of the city of New York was running the MTA, and he's one of the most able public servants I've ever encountered in my life. I have tremendous admiration for him. He's a terrifically able guy, and he did a terrific job at the MTA, and he's doing a terrific job in the city.
Any other respondents on that one? Sigrava.
I bow to nobody in my admiration and, matter of fact, affection for the subway, and it's my system. I use it and I defend it, and I certainly celebrate its existence. I think we heard some very interesting presentations this evening. I like what the historians have contributed in making us understand exactly what happened. Those insights are very, very useful to explain the situation we're in at the present time. I join everybody else in applauding what Dick Gravich did. I think he should have stayed there permanently. And I'm certainly inspired by Jeff's outline of the grand plan, by regional plan. I suspect that I may not live long enough to actually see it implemented. Matter of fact, I don't think anybody here is going to live long enough to see it implemented. But traveling around the world, it's quite obvious that other places are doing some things better than we are. And that's a concern. And I've been trying to sort of think, what are the fundamental problems? I mean, doors don't close and some stations are not as clean as they should be. I'm not concerned about that tonight. What exactly is the problem that faces us? And I cannot cope with long-range planning, but today and tomorrow, what should we do? And so I want to probe a little bit the future. And I have actually 4 questions, but let me start with one. And the first question is that the New York City subway system built 100 years ago went as far as the city line and still does that at the present time. And that was a logical thing to do because at that time the built-up city was contained within those boundaries. Now you go to One Cortlandt Park terminal station, that's not the end of the world anymore. And therefore the question here is the integration of making a regional system that works. And we all know the problems with separate agencies and everything else, but I draw your attention to what has been done in some European countries, particularly Germany, where there are separate agencies doing separate things, ranging from the country's railroad system to private ferries, which are all integrated in a federation. They don't lose their identity, but they integrate services. And the most important thing is they pool their money, budget and redistribute those resources. They operate in that format. And the passengers, the users, move through the system without any barriers from one to the other. Now, that situation is something I think that we should aspire to. And the question that I have is, given the metropolitan structure that we have, and given the presence of various agencies, is there any chance at all that we could get greater integration among the various systems than what exists at the present time?
Sounds like a Jeff question.
I'd like to tackle that in a number of ways. First of all, with respect to the, I'll answer first in the negative and then in the positive. With respect to the city line, I think one of the problems with extending the subway system itself is that we are at the edge of reasonable commuting travel times from the edge. And so I think what SIG is getting at is trying to create higher speeds from the, let's say, the inner suburbs, just over the city line. I think one of the things that will help over time is the integration of the fare system, where we'll think about the system as one. But I think the notion of being able to break the membrane between the city transit system and the two commuter railroads needs to happen. There is an example of a project, of one of the many projects that I mentioned, where that is possible, and that is the conversion of the Long Island Railroad's Atlantic branch, Atlantic Avenue branch, the Brooklyn branch, to a subway system. In fact, that is one of the critical portions of that notion of connecting the so-called connection of the Long Island Railroad to Lower Manhattan. It's not connecting the Long Island Railroad to Lower Manhattan. It's using the tracks of the Long Island Railroad to run a different kind of service that could be integrated with the subway system and connect with various points with what is now the Long Island Railroad. But what's interesting is that the Long Island Railroad will not tell you that they're interested in abandoning that line when they connect to Grand Central, which in fact they are interested in doing. But they have a fiefdom at this point to protect. They're not about to say they're going to give something up unless they get something for it. And that has to be that, to break that barrier, you need to have the leadership at the MTA, which is really the umbrella organization of all these subparts. The other point I want to make about the not living long enough to see all of the long list of proposals, I have to say something about that. I think I was trying to be purposely ambiguous when I said a plan for 20, 30, 50, or 100 years. In fact, if you told me today that everything that I proposed would be in place in 80 years, I'd go home happy. But maybe not 100 years. But the point is, yes, these things will take a long time. But the fact is, if we're spreading them over a long time, then all of these are perfectly fundable. And I think that's the spirit in which I made my presentation.
Other responses? All right, we'll do another round, but I'm going to cheat because I have the microphone, and I'm going to throw out a question of my own, if I may. I want to, in fact, press on what I think are the questions that Richard Ravitch has raised and that are facing us now, which are essentially political ones, and to suggest, and I'd be interested in people's thoughts, that in fact the problem is a lot worse than it's being suggested here, because we're talking about a lack of outrage about a particular crisis in a particular part of the city's infrastructure. And I think the issue is deeper. I'll try to suggest this very quickly with a historical reference. In 1886, Henry George, who I would actually throw into the category of potential heroes that was discussed about, Henry George ran for mayor on a platform which, among other things, had two components. One was that the then available public transportation system should be made free to all riders, and two, that the funds to pay for it should come from a tax on what he considered to be an unearned increment in real estate values. His philosophical political position, which, had its cranky aspects, but nonetheless I think is worth considering, is that in fact the people who reaped enormous profits by the increase in land values in New York City were in fact gaining these increased values unfairly, because in fact they did nothing to enhance the value of their land as opposed to any property that they built on it. What they were doing were reaping the benefits that came from both the collective social development of the city and very specifically the development of infrastructure, which in fact brought their workers to and from their places of business, that brought workers to and from department stores and so forth and so on. That in fact the increase in land values were a social, not an individual fact. And that therefore you should think about transferring from one column to the other column on grounds of social equity. I have a feeling that what we're up against at the moment is not simply people who aren't complaining about a particular crisis in the transportation system and politicians who are simply not responding because their immediate self-interest is not an issue. We are in fact involved, I think now, in an ideological war. That many of these businessmen, very distinctly different from David Rockefeller, and many of these politicians, very distinctly different from the people that Mr. Ravitch was dealing with, in fact take it as a point of pride to shrink government to the point that it can all fit into a bathtub where it can be drowned. And that in fact the goal of government is to drastically decrease tax levels and give the money back to the people, or more to the point, to the wealthy people and to the corporations. The theory being that left to their own devices, they will in fact generate the jobs and the revenues, which will then somehow magically increase the values of funds that are coming into the public treasury. I find this a historically and contemporarily dubious proposition. But it seems to me that we have to reflect on whether or not what we are up against is not simply the crisis of the transit system, but the crisis of our collective social, cultural, political infrastructure, which is at the moment under ideological assault. Any thoughts?
Yes. Yes. I would like to respond to that in several ways. First of all, Henry George was a proponent of the single tax, not just for subways and public transportation, but for all public needs. And I don't think we want to get into a discussion, though it's a fascinating one, whether his single tax theory was correct. Second of all, you have to remember that all of municipal government's infrastructure needs were financed historically by the real estate tax. And the whole theory of having the city pay for the construction of the subway system was that as the subway system moved out throughout this city, the assessed value of real estate would increase, taxes would be increased, and they would pay back the money that they borrowed by selling municipal bonds through the receipts of the real estate tax. We live today still with the heritage of the city's cap on the amount of money it can borrow being set as a percentage of the assessed value of all real estate in New York. And that's artificial, since the real estate tax represents less than 50% of the revenues of a city today. So it's an unrealistic cap, one of many reasons why we need a constitutional convention in New York State to review this and many other critical issues of how we pay for things. And without either agreeing or disagreeing with that eloquent statement about the values of our society at this point in history, let me just say very simply that there are many things to take into account in when you decide as a community or as a society how you're going to allocate this burden, this cost burden. And one of them very fairly and definitely is who is the most direct beneficiary. One of the interesting things that's happened in New York is, and there's no question the owners of real estate are the beneficiaries, but one of the interesting things that has happened in the economy of this city, particularly in the last 20 years, that real estate, instead of being owned by individuals, and believe me when I tell you there were many wealthy real estate owners who were extremely helpful to me politically in getting the legislature to support subsidies for mass transit for the reason you just stated. But if you look today, you will see that very few of those people own real estate. This real estate is owned today by fiduciary institutions, Japanese, Dutch insurance companies, foreign pension funds, and it's governed by faceless fiduciaries who don't actively participate in the politics of New York City or New York State. And that has contributed to the what I referred to earlier as the lack of any kind of responsible business participation in the problems of this city and state.
I just want to make one comment. I have this image of drawing a faceless fiduciary. I'm not quite sure. I wish I was a cartoonist, but in any case, I do want to make one point about the free fare and about the real estate, using real estate, land values. I think the notion of making the transit system free is a mistaken notion. I think the rider should contribute to a significant portion of the operating system, just as all the other beneficiaries of the system, the real estate industry should, but also the driver. The driver benefits because without the transit system operating well, there'd be more drivers, and there'd be more space for each of the drivers who are already there to be able to drive. So I think it's an example. I think one of the beauties of what Dick Ravitch did in 1980 is by putting together a whole series of what we can call nuisance taxes and others that hit different people. And I think that the whole notion here is not that there's one magic bullet tax that's going to take care of our problems, but there's a whole series of taxes when put together can address them. But one of them is not to give away the ride for people and let people pay for a portion of the service that they get as well.
Michael.
Well, actually, just on that question of the free fare, I wonder if there is. I mean, this year we're talking about a fare increase, but really, in terms of the subway, we're talking about an increase in the cost of the monthly pass and the weekly pass, and it's still being considered. My paper calls it a fare increase, and everyone else calls it a fare increase, and I guess I'm kind of curious for a historical perspective on this, and also the sort of current perspective on this, because I wonder, from a historical perspective, if someone back in the day were to come, back in the day of the 5-cent fare for decades, were to sort of see I wonder how you guys think that they would see this sort of current debate over the fare increase. And just sort of I'm curious about some historical perspective on how people have dealt with fare increases over the years. Probably not very well. And I guess I'm sort of curious for these guys, their thoughts on should the rider just basically expect regular fare increases, every 2 years or something like that, as they're sort of talking about at this point?
I just answer it first, and then the first article I ever wrote in Mass Transit magazine was called. The first article I ever wrote in my life was for Mass Transit magazine, and it was called "Legacy of the 5-Cent Fare," and it was written in large part because Dick Ravitch had proposed in Albany to fund part of the capital costs out of bonding that would come from future operating revenues, which could be fares or subsidies, if you think about it. And there was a big hullabaloo about that in Albany, and a lot of people said it was a crazy idea, and yet he was making a fairly strong case that if we didn't rebuild the system, we'd have all sorts of problems down the road in the city's economy. And when I looked back, because I had this curious thing where I was working in the legislature, but I was also writing my doctoral dissertation in history, I looked back to the past and the fare, and what had happened really was that back in 1918, this guy Hyland, who I mentioned earlier, had decided to make the 5-cent fare a political issue that he could win elections on. And it became a hot political issue that almost became an irrational political issue. There isn't, as far as I can tell, anything like this issue about the fare in Paris or in London or in Berlin or even in Moscow. Well, Moscow is very cheap, or in Tokyo, where the fares are slightly higher than here, actually. I was just on London, and to go from one zone to another is $3.40 in American dollars for one, very short subway ride. So it became a political issue, and it's sort of the nearest analogy is the rent control issue. Why doesn't rent control disappear? Well, we all know it's because there are more voters that benefit from having rent control, even though in terms of the housing stock, you can make an argument that it's really done a lot to discourage the building of new housing in New York. That's neither here nor there. It's on the same thing. Politicians benefit by making it an issue, and as recently as this morning's newspaper. I mean, so.
Well, again, my preference would be to have a inflation-sensitive source of tax revenues that would ensure that the funding for the system grew automatically and roughly kept pace with fares. And I personally would love to see the percentage, be roughly equally divided between public subsidy and fare box revenue. But I want to share with you a marvelous little anecdote which makes a number of these points. When I was chairman, I had occasion to meet the chairman of the Paris metro system. He was in New York, and I'd gotten a call from the Consul General of France and that he was coming, and we had lunch, and my high school French wasn't good enough, so we had a translator. And I asked him at one point, had he had to raise the fare many times? And he said to me, no, he never raised the fare. And I thought to myself, what a lucky SOB this guy is. But, and I said, how come you never raised the fare? And he said, well, you don't understand. In France, the single biggest component of the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, is the fare. And therefore, every time the fare is raised, it's very inflationary in France, particularly since at that point the French government had nationalized a lot of industries and was the employer of an awful lot of people. And he said, we determined in the government some time ago to increase the subsidy for the transit system than it was in this economy to increase the fare, that it would ultimately cost us more and be much more inflationary and therefore have an indirect economic burden. And that's a very interesting, I thought you'd be interested in that anecdote.
Robert.
Yeah, if I were going to ask questions on fares, I would ask, isn't there some irony in the fact that that it was proposed to raise the fares, which hurts the lowest income riders, at the same time denying them minimum wage going up? And then I would also want to ask, isn't it interesting, you raise the fares, you lose ridership, and you lose the economic transactions that go along with that ridership. So in a sense, raising fares can be seen as taxes, but I'm not going to ask those questions. I'm going to ask you something totally different, and maybe this goes more towards Jeff or towards Peter, who know the system. Many of you know that there are two budgets. There's an operating budget, which is the day-to-day trips that you pay for, and the capital budget, which are all the proposals that we've heard, which make all of our mouths water, and we hope we see something done within our lifetime, if not all this important thing. But the capital budget is broken down into three components, and I think Dick Ravitch talked a little bit about that. One is called state of good repair, and state of good repair is very simple. It's just bringing the system up to where it should be if we're operating normally. And I always say the irony is if Dick Ravitch and then Bob Colley got the system in a state of good repair, where would we be today with that investment? We would be where we should be in the future. So we're really, in a sense, spending twice by not continually investing or having state of good repair. There's normal replacement, replacing the rolling stock, and then, of course, there's capital expansion. And a number of people now have suggested that because money is so tight and we don't know where our capital is coming from, that maybe we should slow down state of good repair and borrow money out of that part of the capital to pay for system expansion. And I just want to know if the panel thinks that's really a good idea.
No.
I'm not so sure your other panelists agree. I thought this would be a good point.
I can't disagree that it would be a mistake to invest in the expansion of the system while you're at a below normal level for the state of good repair. There's no question about you got to fix the hole in the roof before you put a new wing on the house. There's no question about that. But I will point out that the majority, a very significant majority of the investments we're making now or proposing to make in the MTA system for so-called state of good repair and normal replacement are now moving up to the normal replacement level because of the progress we've made over the last 20 plus years. So we're getting at a stage where, and I think I said that in my remarks, that we're at a point where we're getting close to the normal replacement cycle, and we're moving away from doing catch-up, thanks to the work that we've done before. And now we've got to think about the expansion, as well as the normal replacement cycle. So I think that there's a transition period that we're in. The argument that I would make is that, unlike the guns and butter argument we had during the Vietnam War, we need both, and we should not accept the fact we do state of good repair before we accept expansion because we're not going to get enough money. If we accept that, and that's really the first sentence I said, if we accept that, that's what we're going to get. And so we're not about to back off of any of the expansion programs. We need to find, whether it's a nickel and the gas tax, whether it's East River tolls, whether it's a payroll tax or a commuter tax, whether it's a stock transfer tax, whether it's a petroleum business tax. There are all kinds of taxes, many of which are hardly felt by people that can, if directed towards the transportation system. Interestingly, what's happened I think the majority of the people in this room probably were not too happy with the results of Election Day about a week ago, but there was some glimmers of hope. The vast majority of tax referenda for transportation in the United States passed, and there's a common thread to the ones that passed. People were told what the money was going to be used for. The plan was well thought out. They liked what it was the money was going to be used for and said, yes, we'll tax ourselves to put that money towards this transportation project or program. And what the citizens of New York have not been given the opportunity to do is to have that kind of voice in what they want their money to be used for. And I think if we begin to do that, we can begin to do the expansion projects as well as to make sure that the state of good repair is completed and we move into the normal replacement cycle.
I don't disagree with Jeff at all, but let me suggest a different context to look at this. If you start off with the view that the amount of money that is available is so limited that you have to choose between the two, then clearly I would opt for the first, as Jeff acknowledged he would as well. But think for a minute about what's happening to this city. Think about what the office rent was in Rockefeller Center in 1975, and think of what it is today. Now, expenses have gone up, but nowhere near the rate of inflation in the value of real estate. Look at what people are earning today. Look at the population growth. Look at all of the economic indicators, that the gross national product, however you want to measure it in New York City, and ask you what multiple it is today of what it was in 1975. I pick 75 as a arbitrary low point. And then ask yourself, what is, if the proportion of our wealth that we ought to be devoting to public things? I mean, we're talking about transportation, but the same thing would apply to the schools. There's still a couple of hundred schools in the city of New York that aren't adequately heated. And the question is, how is our wealth being utilized and how much of it should be made available? And is it important to the people of this city to have public transportation expanded? What are the economic benefits to the city? What will be the increase in assessed value of real estate if we build a Second Avenue subway from the Bronx down to Lower Manhattan? probably not in the short term enough to pay for it per se, but the economic benefits will be enormous, and it will make vast areas of this city much more desirable places to live, and therefore much easier to develop and build affordable housing in those areas if this transit system is expanded. So it's, as you know very well, it's a complicated question, but you have to look at this dynamically and not statically. You can't just look at it at a given point in time. You have to look at the longer-term consequences of public investments. And that's another thing that's not being debated. I mean, the governor's announced all these programs, all these projects, but hasn't the vaguest idea how he's going to pay for them. And nobody is connecting the dots between the infrastructure needs of this city and the fiscal resources that are currently available. And if anybody attempted to make that connection graphically, and I fault the media for this, in a serious way, then I would think that people would have to begin to debate it. And if this society decided and wanted to ignore the public infrastructure, so be it. But people don't have the facts and the information that gives them a fair shot at making the kinds of individual political decisions that could result in a change.
Just to sort of add to what Dick said and put it in some kind of context, if you use the years around 1975 as a benchmark, it seems to me there's a crisis in three of the most important public institutions in the city of New York. One is the transit system, one is the schools, one is the police department, in the sense that the police department is dealing extremely inadequately with a crime problem that continues to grow. The difference between then and the New York City that we live in now is that in two of those three cases, there's been considerable success in changing the situation from what it used to be. So you have the success in the transit system, and I think considerable success in the policing system. Not without its flaws, but the dramatic reduction in crime, I think, has made life in the city better for all New Yorkers over the last 15 years. You would not want to slip back into a situation where at least two of those three were functioning back the way they were before, because I think that would be very, very dangerous for the city as a whole, and it would dramatically, I'm trying to find a polite word to say it, just toss in the garbage the enormous success of public institutions like the transit system, like the police department, and some school reformers in reviving the credibility of the public institutions that are New York City's lifeblood, and guaranteeing some level of equity, some level of decency for a broad spectrum of our inhabitants.
All right, now Mr. Ravitch has to go, and the rest of us are going to turn to pumpkins in a minute, but we're going to give the last question to Sig Grava.
I'm going to, excuse me, I'm going to follow Buzz's example and say that I was going to ask about technology because basically, I'm sorry, basically we have 19th century technology in the subway. We have the Metro card, and that's about it. But I know the answer to that question: how do we improve technology? More money. So that leads me to the same question again, the discussion that just took place. But let me put it in a different context. We found out last week that there are red states and there are blue states. And we are certainly a blue state. And this city is definitely a blue city. And if the rest of the country looks at the New York City subways through the lens of morality or whatever central values are, we are not going to do so well, even perhaps less so than we have done up to now. So that's one dimension that concerns me. What can we expect in the future from the national wealth coming to our subways? The other dimension of the same question is that we are in a very complex, very large region, and the regional plan counted, 2,400 separate units of government. All of those units are fiercely protective of home rule, their own right, and I don't think there's any of those units who would voluntarily contribute resources to the upgrading of New York City subway system. So the threat here is that we may be left alone by ourselves, much more than we are at the present time, and have to face these issues and do the things that are necessary. We are the center of the universe, so therefore maybe it's expected, but it is a frightening prospect. And I would like to get some reaction, maybe from the historians. I mean, is there hope?
Well, I'd like to pick up on what Dick Ravitch said. I mean, that the reason the Metropolitan Transportation Authority was created was to suck in the suburban counties together with the transit system in terms of worrying about regional transit systems. Now, there was a barrier about expanding the subway system into the suburbs, but the way the world works in Albany, where I happen to work for 5 years, is that the deal is always that the commuter railroads get more money than they really need, or more money than the transit authority should get, because they're a relatively small component. They get about 20 to 25% of the money in the subway system and bus system in New York, get about 75% of the money in most of the deals that are cut. So what you've essentially got, because there are a large number of people in the suburbs that work in New York City, and especially because the suburbanites, for example, the 22% of Nassau County residents who work in New York City, they make much more than the average resident who lives in Nassau County and works in Nassau County. So it's the upscale people working in the financial sector and the other high-pay industries in New York that are bringing money back to Nassau County. And the people in Nassau County know that, which is one of the reasons there was support for the transit system as a whole in the legislature. So every deal that's cobbled together in Albany is done basically because of this trade-off between the commuter rail system, which affects the whole region that the MTA serves, and the subway and bus system. And it's worked pretty well so far. It certainly worked when Dick Ravitch was in Albany. He was able to successfully bring in the suburban politicians. In fact, the two key politicians that put together his program were both from Long Island, not from New York City. So that's number one. I think we can do it as a region, and there's enough potential tax in the region, gas tax or whatever kind of tax you want to talk about, a bunch of nuisance taxes, some of which already exist, but you can expand on that, to raise enough revenue. And Jeff and RPA has put together a whole series of things that you could get from different taxes, if you're willing to talk regional taxes. And it's been done in the past before. The other thing I'd say about the federal government is that the federal government hasn't really changed its relative contribution to the MTA capital program since the first one in 1982. It's been about 33%, fairly steadily. And if anything, it's going to go down slightly. So any illusion that some local politicians seem to have that the federal government is going to be rolling in as a deus ex machina to take care of this problem is not going to happen. It's got to be solved regionally if it's going to be solved at all. And that means that the state government, together with the city government, are really the primary players here. And it all comes back. The man who used the words courage has now left, but he said you have to have courage in the political leaders to deal with these issues. And I won't say any more of what he told me privately, but about what's going on right now. I mean, you don't have anybody stepping up to the plate right now to deal with this issue. And that's part of the problem.
I think everyone who's stepping up to the plate is in the employ of George Steinbrenner. That may be why. But let me just add one point about the federal side of that, and that is it is true that we've had pretty much of a constant contribution from the federal government. But one of the things that's going on now is that throughout the nation, there are all sorts of what we refer to as new starts, new rail projects, and in some cases bus projects, which are now, where funding is being sought throughout the country. And those sorts of projects are much more difficult for us to get our, quote, fair share. And some of our big expansion projects that I spoke about are in that category. And I think while the current MTA chairman believes he can get 50% of the funding for these projects, I'm somewhat skeptical that that's the case. And so I think that we're really in a faith-based time now, and that in that sense, God helps those who help themselves. And in the sense that the federal government is not going to, quote, bail out our transit projects, they're going to contribute to it, but not to the extent that we would hope. If we want to build these things, then we've got to start thinking about the ways of raising revenues that we spoke about tonight.
All right, I think we'll draw the line there. Thank you all so much for coming. And thanks so much to our distinguished panel and questioners.